Good morning from Melbourne, everyone. Welcome to Optimizely's Experimentation Methodology webinar series. This is Holly Joshi. This is the third in our series of 6 as we work our way through that experimentation methodology process. Excited today to have James Spittal, who's the CEO and founder of Web Marketing ROI with us. And today's webinar is going to be ideation, test ideas and QA steps for maximizing your win rate. Super excited that we're getting this kicked off today. Just a couple of housekeeping items. We are recording, so do keep that in mind. Everyone is in listen mode, but while we're in listen mode and throughout the presentation, do feel free to type in any questions you might have in the section on the right-hand side, and we'll be answering those at the end of the webinar. Do note, we're going to have the slides and presentation available. Right after the webinar, we'll be sending emails out, and we'll be able to answer all the questions, though, that we've got. If we don't get to them all at the end of the webinar, we'll make sure that we directly contact you. If anything happens with, technical problems, so if we get cut off or if we lose connection, don't worry, we'll dial back in, so stay tuned. And we're going to get started here, everyone. So just a quick, where are we in this series location kind of orientation. So Optimizely's experimentation methodology has 6 steps. So far, our last couple of webinars, we've had a look at preparation. So it was in regards to how to build a business case and behavioral economics. So we are excited to be moving into the ideation phase. So orientation, you are here. Hoping everybody can see that slide nice and clear. So on this journey that we've got for optimization, leading us today is James Spittal and myself. So I'm Senior Customer Success Manager for Optimizely. And as noted, James is the awesome CEO and founder of Web Marketing ROI. And James, I just have to say, you can all see our pictures now, but I have to say, what happened with the color and this kind of intense stare that you've got going on in these pictures here?
Well, thank you for the introduction, Holly. You're quite right. It is a fairly intense stare. It's actually funny. There's a bit of a CRO story to that, which I might tell quickly. Being the I suppose, inner data science geek that I am, we actually do a fair bit of kind of LinkedIn style outreach at Web Marketing ROI. Originally, I had a fairly standard, fairly smiley, fairly kind of happy profile picture. And I suppose out of curiosity, as a bit of a hypothesis or a test, we actually came up with this new photo thanks to our brilliant corporate photographer. We actually checked the performance of this versus the other photo, and funnily enough, this one won. So that's the one we're using today.
I'm still going to say my smiley face would probably win, but maybe we'll leave that to the audience later. But without further ado, I'd like to get us into the real meat of what we're going to talk about today. So James, please take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Holly. As you quite rightly said, I am the founder and CEO of Web Marketing ROI. We're a Optimizely solutions partner and CRO agency. Personally, I first started using Optimizely and other A/B testing tools in sort of early 2011. I guess a funny fact about me, I actually built my first website when I was 7 years of age. In primary school, I had a natural inclination for pulling things apart. Funnily enough, I actually destroyed a telephone in primary school because I was naturally curious about how it kind of worked. I'm an active and full-time practitioner of CRO, and as you can probably tell, a lifelong, I suppose, results-obsessed marketer, growth hacker, and all-round tech geek. And today, I like to still stay on the coalface, so I regularly pick and launch tests even 6 years later, every day at Web Marketing ROI. So the agenda for today, we're going to be talking about really how to get more lift out of your experimentation, how to actually improve your win rate, how we think you should approach CRO, and there's a lot of different viewpoints on this. And ultimately, because we're in the ideation stage here, we want to get into the nuts and bolts of CRO. So how do you actually pick better tests? How do you actually get better winners? How do you actually drive results? We've obviously, if you tuned into the first or second webinar in this series, you've probably worked out a bit about how to build a business case. You've worked a bit about how to look at behavioral economics. What we're going to talk about today is what is the difference between a test that gets, has a higher win rate, and how can you kind of improve velocity and win rate and really get better results out of your overall CRO program? So why not answer that? And then we're going to go to QA. So a bit about Web Marketing ROI as a company. Our number one priority as a business is really creating wealth and success for our clients through conversion rate optimization and testing. We've been lucky enough and privileged to work with many of Australia's top brands in verticals like online retail, wagering, utilities, education, and even a number of different businesses in North America, Hong Kong, and internationally. We're very proud to say that we've been able to get some outstanding results for clients, and we've also had some cases where we have had, I suppose, tests that haven't been massive winners, which have probably been some of our biggest learnings. We've got a very, very heavy tech culture at Web Marketing ROI. We kind of like to hire developers who can market and marketers who can code and vice versa. We're also proud for the geeks listening in here. We actually developed the world first PHP library and wrapper for the Optimizely version 2 REST API, which is open source and available at the link you can see there. And we're heavily invested in conversion R&D. We've got our own methodology I'll be talking about today, and a number of different tools for delivering enterprise CRO at large scale, analyzing test results, and so on.
I have high hopes with all that creds deck that you've got up there for some.
Well, it's kind of the obligatory introduction slides, isn't it?
All right.
So thanks very much. So first of all, to set the tone for today's webinar, I want to talk a bit about the idea of theory versus academia. So as much as possible today, we're going to be talking about, like I said before, nuts and bolts, real world stuff. What can we do to get results? Sometimes there's a bit of a gap between, I suppose, some of the theory of CRO and the doing of CRO. And I guess one thing I really want to kind of call out here is, you'll see here this concept of the testing hero. The testing hero is a concept that Optimizely, I can't take credit for it myself, although I'd love to. It's a concept that Optimizely came up with themselves, and it's something that I've seen in market myself in Australia and many other markets internationally for many years. Often when CRO starts to happen, especially in a large organization, it's often driven by maybe one individual who's a bit of a change maker, who could be fairly called a testing hero. And quite often they are almost like a change agent or a bit of an evangelist for CRO. And they've got this quite often gargantuan task of trying to essentially influence and inspire and lead an entire organization through almost a bit of transformation when it comes to CRO. Not everybody gets CRO, not everybody gets testing, not everybody understands what it is or why it matters. And you've got to remember that this is a fairly new emerging market. So I want to kind of congratulate all of you who have tuned in. By listening to today's webinar, there's a good chance that you yourself are a testing hero in a large organization, or maybe even a smaller organization. But either way, it's very heroic. And I think, there's a lot of persistence and commitment required to keep it up. So I want to call it out. So let's talk a bit about kind of 101, what is CRO? And I think this, in some ways, this is a simple question to answer, but there is actually a fair bit of complexity to it, which we won't cover all of which today. So, generally when you first want to kind of solve a question or find out what something is, you go to Google and you consult Google. And these are the official definitions from Wikipedia and also Unbounce, what they think, how they define conversion rate optimization. Both definitions are fairly accurate. Our view at Web Marketing ROI is that conversion optimization is really an outcome, not necessarily a service. And the reason for that is quite clear. Let's say, for example, you are redesigning a web page, or you're redesigning an entire website end to end, or perhaps you're redesigning a key landing page. The question that I wrestled with many years ago is, well, is that conversion optimization? Well, sometimes it is, if it actually increases your conversion rate. Other times, maybe not. So in short, there are many different ways to improve conversion rate: web design, landing page design, A/B testing, user experience design, usability testing, and there's a lot of different drivers and I suppose levers you can pull here. The one we're going to be predominantly talking about today is A/B testing. But it's fair to say there are many different levers you can also pull in the future. So I suppose I want to tell a bit about my story of how I got into conversion optimization and how I went from being, essentially someone whose full-time role was predominantly around information security. I used to work for Deloitte, where it was my job to basically hack into the banks. And I suppose I really got this kind of natural inclination and passion towards CRO about 6 years ago. That kind of happened shortly after starting Web Marketing ROI. So at the time, we had a client who had a fairly significant spend on Google AdWords. And they were essentially acquiring leads through Google AdWords to basically provide those leads to essentially to be resold almost as an affiliate. The problem was, despite their fairly large Google AdWords expenditure, essentially what was happening was they were basically selling these leads for cheaper than they were getting them for. In other words, their CPA was higher than what they were selling the leads to the particular organization for. So as you can probably work out, it wasn't profitable. In fact, it was quite bad because essentially they had financed a lot of the advertising costs from Google AdWords, and essentially the business owner was on the fast track to basically bankruptcy. And they had a ticking clock, excuse me, in terms of the amount of time they would have before they ran out of cash. So they came to us very, very stressed out and basically said, what can we do? Now, at the time, without necessarily having a huge kind of level of experience as CRO, but nevertheless having a genuine inclination and genuine desire to want to help the client, we fired up the testing tool that was closest to us at the time, and more or less launched some A/B test ideas just simply off blog posts. So we actually Googled A/B test ideas, conversion ideas, things of that nature. Read a whole bunch of blog posts, and basically just tested what seemed to be the obvious stuff to test. Then we got a bit more advanced with our testing too, but that's how we kind of begun. I guess you could call it beginner's luck, because without really knowing what we were doing, we actually achieved some incredible results. And it was around that time that I first realized just the pure value and impact that conversion rate optimization can have in literally turning a business from being unprofitable on the verge of bankruptcy to being profitable and later on selling for quite a hefty price. And I think that's really the power of conversion optimization. That's why I get excited about CRO. Of all the disciplines that are out there, it is by far the most sophisticated and most complicated. I would say many of orders of magnitude much more difficult than SEO or PPC management, for example. But it's also one of the most rewarding in terms of the impact and leverage you can have on a business. So all of that should be fairly self-explanatory for many of you. I'm presuming most of you who are in attendance today probably have already launched a fair few tests, and probably one of the main questions on your mind is, what can we do to get better results? And that's the question on every CRO's mind. So our approach for that is to look at the following formula, first of all. So the formula is your CRO results are equal to your velocity, which is the number of tests you launch on a monthly basis, multiplied by your average impact per test. In other words, how much lift did you get on average per test, multiplied by your win rate, which is in other words means how many wins did you have if you launched 100 tests, for example? Did you have 5 winners, 10 winners, 50 winners, 70 winners? What's your percentage there? And the core idea is quite simple. If we can improve either velocity, average impact, or win rate, our overall CRO results are going to improve overall. So this is a powerful way to communicate to stakeholders within your business, a powerful way to communicate in terms of executives. And I think it's also a powerful model yourself of thinking about how to manage your own organizational CRO.
How phenomenal is this? When in our lives have we always said, if somebody would just tell me exactly what it is I need to do, show me the formula, here you go, you've got one of the formulas. And I know there's a lot more good stuff coming up, so keep it engaged.
It's almost like if only they gave you the answers to the exam before you sat the exam at uni. Absolutely.
Exactly.
If I knew this on day one when I was thinking about CRO back many, many years ago, I think it would have helped a lot, that's for sure. So let's talk about the first of these, velocity. Velocity is undoubtedly the easiest, and we'll talk a bit about that. And then we've got average impact and win rate. So velocity. As I said before, velocity is the number of tests launched on a monthly basis. Now, for everyone sort of in attendance today, the first question you should probably ask yourself if you're not already, is if I think about my average number of tests actually launched in the last, say, 6 months or 3 months, what's that number? Now, if that number is less than 2, you've probably definitely got some work to do. If that number is maybe less than 6, you might have some work to do. But maybe if you're 6 or greater, I'd say you're probably in a very, very high kind of area for velocity. But you've obviously still got area for improvement. You can always do better in terms of velocity. So how do we actually improve velocity? Well, one of the main bottlenecks, of course, of velocity is always resources. So one thing we see a lot in organizations is often there will be essentially a small CRO team, which might have maybe 0.5% of a role, or maybe one full-time role, or maybe several full-time roles. And generally, those resources aren't that technical. When it comes to writing JavaScript and jQuery, it's not necessarily your area of expertise or your background. And generally, there'll be some developers, front-end devs, who may or may not be Optimizely certified, who might have some confidence in terms of writing tests and Optimizely in jQuery and maybe even with the visual editor as well. So one of the big bottlenecks there is when you, as part of the CRO team, want to come up with a test idea, you generate that idea, and then you go to your dev team and you say, let's build this out in JavaScript, let's build this out in jQuery. Now, often those devs might be a shared resource. So like so many developers in so many organizations, they've got requirements and new tickets coming from every different person in the organization on many, many different things. And because they're not focused purely on Optimizely, their speed of building out Optimizely tests might be a bit slower. They might take them more hours. Their quality of test creation might be a bit lower, and there might be some more challenges. And even sometimes actually building the business case to actually get and keep those resources focused can be very tricky. So I suppose this is one thing that I have personally, which is, I suppose, a bit of an advantage, because I'm essentially a developer first and a marketer second. I've always been able to build out tests myself, and JavaScript and jQuery comes naturally to me. What I think a lot of marketers don't necessarily understand, a lot of CROs don't understand, is that JavaScript and jQuery in particular are not that complicated. If you go to the relevant closest bookstore and you buy maybe an $80 book on JavaScript or jQuery, I would say with probably a day's worth of reading, you could probably build out some fairly simple tests, some headline tests without too much difficulty, which might down the line save you a lot of hours. So that's one way to kind of expedite your output for your velocity. You can also add to the front-end development team. One great way to add to test velocity is there are many different, obviously, solutions partners and agencies, some of which can handle all of CRO, some of which focus just on test development. There are even dedicated organizations around the web that can focus purely on test development and nothing else. So one great way to increase velocity is just to throw, resources at it, time at it, money at it, a partner, find one partner, and you don't have to have just one, too. Many organizations we've found might work with maybe 3 different Optimizely solutions partners, or they might have one partner for test development, another partner for ideation, so on and so forth. Another thing I would highly, highly recommend, and I'm actually surprised that more front-end developers don't, and more CRO teams don't take advantage of this, is that the Optimizely Developer certification in particular, which I've actually been through, is a fantastic body of knowledge for really, I suppose, getting better at building out test ideas, but also building out tests in such a way that they don't cause problems, that they QA properly, that you can troubleshoot them if there's issues. And so it gives a good common language by which CRO teams are able to speak. So if you're not a developer yet, you might find that exam to be quite tricky. But I'd certainly recommend that if you've got any front-end developers on your team who are heavily involved with test creation in-house, definitely encourage them to do the Optimizely Developer certification.
I would also say don't dismiss velocity in this context because of traffic. I know that there are lots of ways around that. And the other thing I think that's important to mention in regards to velocity is when we're talking about momentum. A lot of this is because if you've got those tests getting created by these developers or yourself as a marketer with these skills, you're going to have the next test ready. Otherwise, you might have to run it for, say, a month. But if you've got the next test ready, you're not going to lose the momentum that you're trying to create to keep this velocity going within your CRO program.
Absolutely. The velocity comes about in 2 ways, not just, as Holly quite rightly said, not just about the actual results, but there's also a bit of an organizational change type phenomenon that goes on here, where sometimes it's important to have a lot going on just to keep everybody focused on this initiative kind of organizationally. And I think that in itself is another kind of external benefit that comes from velocity beyond the obvious financial impact and the results and the lift. So there's no doubt that velocity is the easiest lever to pull when it comes to getting better results in your CRO program. You can simply throw more money at it, more time at it, and you'll have generally more velocity. It's definitely the easier of the 3. But the more difficult of the 3 would definitely be both win rate and average impact. And this is where I think the mastery of CRO really comes about. I think it's very straightforward to become a beginner to CRO and launch your first test. But I think true mastery of CRO I would define as being able to predict more accurately the results of a test, and being able to come up with test ideas that are more likely to be winners for any given particular segment or audience. This is by far the most difficult thing there is in CRO. There are entire blogs and books written about this subject and this subject alone. And I think, you could spend the next 10 years of your life studying copywriting, UX design, graphic design, persuasion, sales, marketing, and still not be a true master of this. And this is probably the area of CRO that excites me the most. So let's talk a bit about win rate and average impact. One thing that comes up a bit, and we hear a lot, which is kind of an argument against win rate perhaps, is, well, look, we don't have many winners right now. We've maybe got an average win rate, but for the tests we don't have that aren't winning, at least we've learned something. Now, while that is undoubtedly true, and it does of course, any failed test is still a customer learning that can later be hopefully turned into a win, I think it's also important to acknowledge that often executives themselves may not be necessarily thrilled by that answer. And I think also it's important to note that learnings don't always necessarily pay the bills or drive revenue. At the end of the day, commercial entities are there to generate revenue and profit. And learnings are good, but obviously wins in terms of lift are always better. Two important points too that are worth considering is when you have a failed test, one way to turn a failed test into a winning test is to segment it better, e.g. personalization. And another way to turn it into a winning test is just take that insight and apply it later on.
Okay, James, I have to play a bit of devil's advocate here.
Please do, Holly.
I've been in an executive role prior, and it's hard to justify. I mean, we did do our webinar on buy-in, but I'm talking about, like, say you've got a 50-50 win rate, and it's really hard to say, oh, 50% are negative or neutral. So can you give our listeners at least 2 points you would suggest that support the 50%? Like, tell me 2 other justifications that I can take to my executive team or the board and say, look, yeah, 50%, or, maybe it's not even 50%, we're negative or neutral. Like, what are some other reasons that's okay?
Look, that's actually a fantastic question, Holly, because you're quite right. One of the biggest challenges of CRO is not just the doing of the CRO, but it's also the selling of it internally to the organization to make sure that everyone at the executive level gets what's going on, is excited about it. And you probably are going to get some tough questions, like, for example, well, a 50% win rate isn't good enough. Well, how could we address that question specifically if we were posed that question? Well, one way I would answer that question is that, first of all, it's important to acknowledge that depending upon which research study you look at, the average benchmark or win rate in industry for a test, if you look at kind of every test created in one of the other competitors, or from some of the data that's also available from some of the testing tools, it's generally quoted to be somewhere between 7% and 14%. In other words, probably about 10% is what a fairly normal kind of average win rate. So 50% win rate is still 5 times better than what we would kind of call the normal industry benchmark or average. I wouldn't be satisfied with 10%, but that is kind of the norm. The other point I would make is that for those 50% where we didn't have a winner, one thing I think that's very, very important is when that's communicated to the executives, it's important to make it clear that that does save resources. So what it does is, if you, for example, test, let's say it was 10 tests, 5 of those are losers. For those losers, let's consider they were possibly new features that you were considering building out with your dev team. Well, by deciding that they don't actually affect the most important user metrics and backing that up with data, what we've then been able to do is decide later on, well, maybe we don't want to invest all this back-end development resources and PHP development or whatever it might be to actually get these features built. So those 5 losing tests could actually save us hundreds of thousands of dollars of development time that we don't have to invest later on, because maybe they don't really move the needle. Does it make sense?
Yeah, certainly. Love it. So 2 great points to also take back to the executives. Thanks.
All right. Thanks for the great question, Holly. That kind of flows in very nicely into, so let's talk a bit about win rate and average impact, as we were saying before. So how do we actually improve win rate and average impact? Let's say we want to move the levers on those. What do we need to do? How can we actually get some wins here? Let's say, for example, our win rate is 10%, which is, again, fairly average. How can we make that 20% or 30% or 40% or maybe even, like Holly said, 50% or 80%? And how can we actually make sure that the tests we do have that are winners, how can we make sure they create a greater magnitude of lift. So maybe instead of improving conversion rate by 5% or 10%, maybe we're improving conversion rate by 80%, 90%, 100% or more. Well, one thing we can do, which is an immediate quick win, is actually learn to QA better. So let me tell a simple little story on this. So going back to what I was saying before about the Optimizely developer certification, there is a real art to building out tests in Optimizely or any other testing tool very carefully. One of the reasons for that is that front-end development is really complicated. Anyone who's ever been a front-end developer or ever had to work with any web technology, you only need to mention Internet Explorer for them to almost turn pale. You know, browsers are frustrating things. It's nice to think that this web language we work with is ubiquitous and it works cross-device and cross-browser and everything looks the same. But the reality is that's almost never the case. So we've seen many cases where well-intentioned test ideas or test implementations might not render or display in a particular browser correctly, or they might not look as they should in mobile, for instance. So let's imagine a hypothetical scenario. Let's say you've come up with a really good test idea, and let's say you've built it out, but accidentally your front-end developers haven't really QA'd with cross-browser testing as thoroughly as they could have, and they've missed, for example, a critical bug that shows up for maybe all people on mobile devices, for instance, or maybe a particular segment of mobile devices. So let's say you've maybe increased conversion rate on desktop, clobbered it on mobile, and clobbered it for maybe all Apple devices, let's say. Well, when you see your results page in Optimizely, you're just going to see the overall net results as long as it's not segmented. And you may actually think that your winning test is actually a losing test because it's been poisoned by bad QA. So by improving your QA, you are able to get better conversion rate and better lift overall. We had a client come to us not too long ago where when we first did some analysis with them, we looked at their analytics and we found that their conversion rate for Internet Explorer for a particular version was actually 0%. And that instantly said to us, well, there's obviously something seriously wrong with your forms clashing with Internet Explorer. So that was kind of an obvious example where QA wasn't happening as well as it should. And by fixing that, they were able to dramatically improve their conversion rate. But generally speaking, the best way to get a better win rate is to have better test ideas. And the best way to pick better test ideas is to have a very, very thorough methodology and conversion methodology, which we'll talk about ours shortly, and to have a very structured and thorough process for conversion research. So not everybody knows what I mean when I say conversion research, but conversion research has many different examples. So one of the most common examples might be looking at user recordings. It might be looking at heat maps, for example. There's a number of different fantastic tools out there, Hotjar, Kissmetrics, Kiss Insights, Qualaroo, I could go on and on and on. Each of these have different, I suppose, can be different data sources in terms of your overall conversion research. And you should have a very structured and thorough approach to your conversion research. And I would even say that you really should, as a general rule of thumb, be doing maybe as much as 7 hours of hardcore conversion research before actually picking your first test idea. In many cases, we actually do suggest doing kind of 2 weeks of really intense conversion research before kind of starting to plan out your kind of testing roadmap. And that ultimately shows up in your win rate. Another thing you can do, as I said before, is methodology. Now, I'm not going to give away everything there is to know about our sort of key methodology in this webinar, but this is one of our sort of key parts of our intellectual property at Web Marketing ROI, and this is an approach that we've been very, very proud of. It's called the 10 core conversion principles. And it's really the 10 core conversion principles for coming up with improving your win rate and coming up with better test ideas. So one of the things we noticed back in 2011 when we first started doing this was the most common approach to coming up with test ideas is what I would call the Google it and find some blogs and start testing different things approach. And that often leads to testing test ideas like colors of buttons and, let's test red versus blue, things like that. But when you look at test results, and I love looking at test results. One of my favorite websites on the internet is Which Test Won, which has now been renamed as Behave. When you look at a large number of test results, you start to notice something, and you might start to notice what I started to notice, which is that the tests that tend to have the biggest impact on conversion rate tend to fall into a kind of a strategic marketing lever. It's almost like they have a strong hypothesis behind them, or they really work on a persuasion or marketing principle that's a bit more what I would call strategic rather than tactical. In other words, a button color test is a tactical change. A strategic change is, well, we don't think we're communicating our value proposition as well as we could be because our customers actually care about pricing, whereas we think they care about quality, and our headline refers to quality, but actually all our customers want the cheapest price. So by altering our headline to better match our value proposition, we're able to better communicate our value proposition. That's an example of a hypothesis-driven strategic test. And one of our core kind of, I suppose, approaches to CRO at Web Marketing ROI is by using this 10 core conversion principles and understanding each of these different principles, and then using them to come up with test ideas for any given market or any given website. Our philosophy is that you will get better test ideas that have a much higher than average win rate and a much higher than average impact. So I'll talk a bit about 2 of these key principles here. And then the other 8 we can, I'll leave for maybe another day.
But I love that we just got 10 new tools, basically formula and 10 core principles. I'm loving this, James.
It's also evolved a lot over the last 5 or 6 years. This sort of, it used to be a lesser number of principles and it's now 10. So let's talk about one of my favorite, which is value proposition. Now, of the 10, I would say this is probably one of the most important. And I would actually say that value proposition is probably one of the most commonly misunderstood and also most powerful tools available, not just in CRO, but marketing in general, sales and marketing as a whole field. So the first thing is that there are many different definitions of value proposition. Almost everybody you ask talks about, the VP value proposition or USP or unique selling proposition. And if you try to kind of drill down, I think everyone's got slightly different definitions. When we talk about value proposition, my favorite definition is the one from Dr. Flint McLaughlin from Marketing Experiments, who I'm a huge fan of. His definition of value proposition is value proposition is the answer to the question, if I am your ideal customer, why should I buy from you rather than your competitor? If I am your ideal customer, why should I buy from you rather than your competitor? In other words, to find out your own value proposition, the first thing to do is to write down that question and then simply try to answer it yourself and come up with some theories, some hypotheses on why you think they should buy from you rather than your competitor. And something really fascinating about the web is that ultimately when someone lands on your website, that's one of the key questions that's on their mind is, they're looking at, they might have 5 browser tabs open. They might be looking at your landing page in 6 different landing pages, or they might be looking at your homepage and a number of different home pages. They're looking for maybe a solution, or they're looking for a widget, or they're looking for an online sports betting provider, or it might be a particular IT provider, or so on and so forth. And they're making a comparison in their mind. They're thinking about, well, okay, I've got a few different options here as a consumer, and they're trying to make a rational, mostly rational and partially irrational decision about who to select. They've also kind of got hyper ADHD. So everyone on the web is I like to call it hyper attention deficit disorder. So if you've ever watched a usability study or you've ever seen anyone use the web and maybe perform a Google search, you'll see that most users tend to jump from tab to tab to tab. They tend to lose interest very quickly in a particular screen. So the more clearly we both understand our value proposition, which is one thing, the more closely related it is to what the customer actually wants, and the more clearly it's communicated, the better your website's going to convert. Quite simple. So, and this can be done in a simple manner. You can look at your homepage, you can look at your landing pages, you can look at your different channels, and you can simply ask yourself the question as sort of the head CRO, are we really addressing this question, about value proposition? Are we really communicating our value proposition? Another thing we come across quite a bit is quite often businesses will have really, really strong value propositions. But if nobody actually knows what it is, then it's not going to help. So you really need to think about, what is it that makes my business different? What is it that gets people to buy? And try to communicate that to them. And there's many ways that can be done. One of the most common ways is headlines, but it's also imagery. It's also different feature points, copy, and it should be throughout all of the funnel in your website and all different entry points. Tagline is one of my favorites too on this. So this is one of the 10 principles. And let me talk about another one, which is, again, part of the 10 core conversion principles of coming up with better test ideas. Another of my favorites is ethical urgency. So if you've been to booking.com anytime in the last X number of years, and you've gone to book, for example, a hotel, you've probably noticed that whilst booking for a hotel, there might have been something on the screen that said something like there are only 3 rooms left, or there are only 2 rooms left. This is an example of ethical urgency in action. Robert Cialdini talks about the principle of scarcity. So one of the kind of fundamental persuasion principles that are fundamental to human beings is when something is scarce, it makes us want it more. So there's also an important word in this principle, which is the word ethical. We've often seen, particularly internet marketing style websites, where it's perhaps the urgency is unethical, where perhaps you go back to the website a week later and it still says there's only 1 product left, even though you know that there are many, many, many more. So that has negative implications on your brand, and we would definitely recommend against that. But let's say, for example, you sell tickets online, and let's say there are a number of event tickets and you only have a certain number of seats. Well, it's perfectly valid and legitimate to show the number of rooms and tickets you have remaining, and that will ultimately drive conversion rate. It will make people want it more and be more likely to actually take action now. There are many, many examples, but when thinking about this framework and this model, the question you should ask yourself is, the biggest killer of sales is always procrastination. So there's always this fundamental thing of, well, I could buy it, I could take action on it now, but why should I do it now? So the more you can address a reason for the website visitor to take action now, and the more you can back it up with something that's specific and actually real and ethical, the better. So let's talk a bit about conversion research. So I suppose the most common example of what people think of when they think of conversion research, from what I've seen, especially when they're just getting into this, is Google Analytics Web Analytics data. And Web Analytics data is great because it can tell you what your conversion problems are, and it can tell you where to look to some degree and what's broken, but it can't always tell you where to fix it. So my favorite forms of conversion research are survey polls, and we'll talk a bit about survey polls a little bit later. Another one of my favorite forms of conversion research are looking at user recordings. So I'm not sure of the current attendees, how many of you have spent a significant amount of time looking at user recordings of real customers and real users on your website. But if you're not spending at least, say, an hour a day on that right now, I would say that's something you should definitely prioritize, because as a general rule of thumb, I kind of think like every 10 minutes I spend looking at live user recordings of how your website visitors actually use your site, that generally leaves me with at least 1 test idea, sometimes more. So if I spend an hour coming up just watching user recordings, I've usually got 10 pretty good test ideas right there. And they'll probably have a better than average win rate because they'd be based on real customers doing real things on your website. So that's a great example of a discipline that you should really consider if you're not using already. One of the big, I suppose, bugbears that I have is that sometimes I think as CROs and sometimes those new to the industry get a little bit too focused on Google Analytics data, a little bit too focused on just sort of web analytics data in general. As I said before, it's a great way to look for where the conversion problems are, but there is no report in Google Analytics that tells you what to test. It doesn't exist. It might tell you what pages aren't performing. It might tell you where people are dropping out the funnel, but it's not going to tell you what you need to actually put on that site to drive conversion rate, to actually make it convert better. So it will tell you the conversion problems, but not the treatments. And in my view, the more difficult thing is coming up with the high quality treatments, and that requires UX design knowledge, copywriting knowledge, and the use of a methodology like we gave before. So one thing I strongly suggest for everybody on this webinar, if you're not already doing survey polls and you're not already doing user recordings, go and do that like immediately after this webinar. Like it's not that hard. You can go to hotjar.com or any other tool. It's fairly cost effective, and if you haven't already got it set up on your site, you can use it, get it set up there. It takes 5 minutes to integrate via GTM, and today you can start collecting both user recordings of how people are actually interacting with your website, and I'd even say go and launch your first survey poll if you haven't already done that. And there's a lot of things you can do with survey polls. One of my favorites is target the post-purchase page. In other words, the thank you page after they've purchased. The reason we suggest doing that is because you know therefore that they're qualified. And maybe ask the question, what's one thing that nearly stopped you from buying today? Or what's one thing that nearly stopped you from expressing interest for this white paper today, or downloading this thing today, or placing a bet today, or whatever it might be, the conversion action. And by asking that immediately after the conversion action, what you'll find is, because it's on the thank you page, first of all, you'll have a purely qualified list of respondents. So you'll know that they're not just general web traffic, but you'll also get some very interesting answers, and they'll probably be ones you don't expect. So we've run this for a number of different clients, as well as about 30 different questions we often use for kind of survey polls that have been specifically written for kind of conversion research. And I'm never ceased to be blown away and surprised by some of the answers we get. There's always sort of common ones about buying criteria and free shipping and things like that. But there's always a lot in there that just have you just would never expect or would never be able to guess without doing the research. One of my favorite examples of that is we were doing some testing for basically a bodybuilding brand whose audience was all made up of bodybuilders. When we ran the survey poll, the answers that came back all complained about that it was too hard to remember their password. And at first that really shocked me because it was actually on WordPress, so it was fairly standard in terms of the password complexity. It was the same as basically every WordPress site. But we realized after the fact, when we kind of tried to apply a hypothesis to it retroactively, that, well, I mean, ultimately, this is an audience of bodybuilders. They're not necessarily able to remember uppercase, lowercase, stars, characters, asterisks, everything else of the sort. And so try to make it easy for the users. And maybe that's even more important to that particular audience segment than some other audience segments. So if you're not already, go and run some survey polls. At least come up with one new survey poll a week. And try to spend as much time as possible on watching actual user recordings. And I think you'll find your conversion research, that's two very, very small things, but I think you'll find your ideas will become much closer to what will actually move the needle.
Just want to make one more mention. So we just demoed this the other day to a client, and I realized probably 50% of you out there might know about this, but maybe the other 50% doesn't. There is a feature within Optimizely, and I've always basically underrated this, but saw it in action and was really excited about it, where you can tell, so say the customer takes 3 steps, and after 3 pages, they go and convert. But if you notice that they've gone to 2 and they're falling off, there is a section within Optimizely X where you can do a pop-up and ask them if they want help. And you can base that on time, duration on site. So that's another area, especially if you've integrated with like a Hotjar, where you can pop up that poll or pop up that survey at that point. Yeah, it's a balance between whether you want to interrupt that flow, but if you already know the customer journey and you know that's an exit point, then you try and grab their attention at that point in the flow.
I love it. That's a brilliant point. And I also want to draw, for those of you who are listening in today who aren't aware of the relatively new integration between Optimizely X and Hotjar, that's another reason why that works quite elegantly. But yeah, you can also equally build these out. It doesn't have to be any particular tool. If you've got a half-decent dev resource, you can often build out in pure JavaScript or jQuery a survey kind of modal yourself. And you can even then maybe tag that into, if you're using Optimizely DCP, for example, you could build it out in terms of actually capturing that data and actually storing that data against that particular Optimizely cookie and remembering that for the future, and then maybe even personalizing based upon it, which is a very exciting thing that we saw too. So let's imagine where we've just taken over as the CEO or CMO of a pure digital struggling company. And let's say we want to kind of growth hack it and we want to move the needle in terms of financial results and conversion rate as quickly as possible. One of the first things I would do is watching actual users and watching screen recordings, because as I said before, the more time you spend doing that, the better ideas you're going to have, and you're going to find some things that you probably aren't aware of right now. You're going to find bugs and issues and different ideas. And actually talking to the users. If, for example, one of us took over as maybe the new CEO of a retail store, probably the first thing we would do would be talk to actual customers. But sometimes in the purely digital e-commerce environment we live in, we get a bit disconnected from our real customers and from our real users, and we forget that there are actually people behind the numbers we see in analytics. But one great way to actually get sort of reveal some of the psychogram behind those numbers is to actually run survey polls and actually ask them questions and engage with them. So to give kind of an example of just one particular case study, and there are many others too, that kind of illustrates all of this done well. In other words, they've done a lot of conversion research. They've done sort of one major change that had a very, very high impact. And granted, doing the velocity on this kind of change would be quite difficult, but there's a lot of conversion research that went in here, and they had a huge winner. You can see here, high rise. So I suppose one thing I see a bit too is this principle of OFAT, one factor at a time. Some of you might have seen talks by Ronnie Koharvey of Microsoft fame. He's done a lot of sort of research into OFAT versus other approaches in experiment design. Of the two, I'm sort of lean towards experiment design versus OFAT, and I think OFAT tends to be better when you're a bit more of a beginner at coming up with kind of ideas and kind of designing experiments. But as you get more sophisticated, although more difficult, if you want to move the lever more, a greater way to do that is to go for a larger redesign and then bundle it as a large test sort of thing, as you can see here. So in the case of high-rise, or 37 signals, they actually tested the complete design you see on the left versus the complete redesign you see on the right. And what they saw as a result was actually 102% improvement in conversion rate. Now that's quite huge. If you look at kind of the average impact that you generally see for most tests, it's very rare to see a single test that moves the needle in conversion rate by as much as 102%. There wasn't just one call to action they changed. They didn't just start with just the headline, or they could have focused there. They actually started with the whole redesign. And this can only be done with expert educated guesses of what's likely to perform, with expertise in terms of CRO, with excellent UX design and excellent conversion research. So if I had to summarize my biggest advice for CRO in one sentence, I would say that to really maximize results, in addition to everything that we've talked about today, I think you want to be brave, and I think you really want to swing for the fences. I think you need to really be, okay with slaying some sacred cows when it comes to coming up with test ideas, because ultimately testing gives you a framework in which it's safe, and experimentation gives you a framework in which it's okay to take sort of chances, because you're insured. The worst case is that you have a failing test and you can turn it off, no big deal. But the more you can back that by really good conversion expertise and research, the better. So that's kind of the conclusion of the core content from today's webinar. One thing, I suppose, as I was putting this webinar together, I was thinking about what could I do in terms of adding value to all the attendees here today. And after discussing it with the Optimizely team, I thought that one way we could actually benefit, this is ultimately a webinar about getting better results and ultimately improving velocity. So one way you can improve velocity is by partnering with an organization who can help you build out tests. So with that in mind, for every attendee, we're going to sort of back ourselves here and I suppose be a major value add, hopefully, for the people on this webinar and for the action takers. For those of you who might want some help in building out a test free of charge within Optimizely, simply just shoot us an email at james@webmarketingroi.com.au, mention this webinar, say hello, introduce yourself, and completely free of charge, we will, if you just give us your best test idea, so, hi James, I'd like to implement the following test, here's a mock-up, we can actually build it out in Optimizely for you. We will do one of those for you free of charge. Or if you have no idea about to test next, we can actually build out, we can actually come up with our 3 best ideas from our own research, and we'll help you implement one. Again, this is not a sales pitch in the sense that we are obviously quite busy as a business, but I thought this might be one way if you're looking to improve some of your own results, it might be of value. But thank you very much, Holly. It's been a pleasure presenting this content. I hope everyone on this webinar got a great amount of value of it and provided some thoughts. We're going to open it up to Holly and Q&A at this point in time.
Yeah, just before we close, we do have a couple of questions that have come through. So first, what do you think of gamification in CRO?
Brilliant question. Look, there are many different types of gamification in CRO, and it's quite a broad field, so a little bit difficult to answer in one sentence. I think gamification has a huge role to play, and sometimes some of our recommendations for our clients has been to almost consider gamification. In other words, when they've engaged us to come up with test ideas, one idea and it has many different forms, one idea we've had with some of our clients is by kind of implementing gamification better on their site, they can kind of drive user behavior and they can ultimately drive engagement, and then generally that contributes to actual conversion rate. Alternatively, you might mean gamification in terms of actual testing itself. but I'm not sure. I hope that answers your question.
Cool. Second question, is Hotjar your preference for screen recordings?
Yeah, for the large part it is. And I guess it's just an example simply because it's one that gets used a fair bit in the Australian market. There are many, many others. There are a few downsides of Hotjar in particular to draw people's attention to. If you use single page applications, like many large enterprises do, Hotjar tends to not perform particularly well. There is also things like Inspectlet, which do a very good job. Hotjar also has some sampling at play, which can sometimes be a bit annoying, but it is also very cost effective. The main questions I would ask when picking a user recording solution or a survey poll solution is, do we have single page applications? How much traffic do we have? And are we okay with sampling? If you kind of answer those questions, you can probably pick one. And also, what's your budget too, obviously, is the most important question.
Sure. So just time for at least one more question that we've got here, and it's in regards to that single page application. How is that going to change the customer experience and help or inhibit users' ability to do better testing?
That's actually a brilliant question. And one thing I've been quite excited about lately at Web Marketing ROI is we've been talking a lot about almost like the new frontier of conversion rate optimization, which I think is kind of is interaction design and single page applications. So I don't know if you've seen, if you've ever, for example, kind of seen some of these websites, they have, you almost jump on there and it's almost like you can play like a game purely in JavaScript. So you can almost have like, there's one which I was sharing with the team recently, which is brilliant, where, you kind of come on the website and then it's like, okay, before you can take action on the next thing and download a white paper, click on this dog and then the dog jumps across the screen of the browser and you use your keys and it goes to the next thing. And this actually is almost like a new frontier. It's almost like the web often seems to go 360. So I remember in the old days we had Flash, and then Flash had numerous problems. But I almost feel like we've come back to the era of Flash, except the modern version of Flash is good interaction design with JavaScript. And I think there is a whole level of possible sophistication in your conversion process that you can bring out by really, really clever interaction design and really, really clever front-end development that, to be honest, most businesses aren't even touching. So, maybe rather than having a form that simply says, what's your first name, last name, and email address, maybe you make that fun and engaging by letting them play some kind of game on the website or letting them move a cursor or letting them follow a particular process so that they have a micro commitment and then they engage towards the commitment you actually want them to take.
Okay, last question, just so we make sure we don't go over time. What about testing on mobile apps, recommendations, and how do some of these ideas apply when it comes to mobile apps?
Look, all of the ideas apply equally to mobile apps and any other device for that context, because ultimately these are fundamental human marketing principles. These don't change based on device. It's important that someone understands the value proposition, whether they're engaging with your app or not. It's important that someone understands, that the content provided to them is relevant, whether it's via desktop or mobile. The context, however, of mobile and a mobile device or a mobile app is different to a large degree, because to some degree, as Marshall McLuhan said, the medium is the message. So when you're engaging with desktop, your context is you're using a mouse, you're not touching the screen, you've got more screen real estate. Fundamentally, in a mobile device, you're using your finger, so it's important that your tap targets are much bigger. You've got much less space to communicate messaging, so you might want to use more imagery. So it is a very different context, but the same principles still apply. I would say you can equally apply these 10 core conversion principles to any mobile app or any mobile device or mobile site as you can a desktop application or a desktop website.
Awesome. So just want to do one last, there we go, Opticon. So if you've enjoyed this webinar and you want to continue to just fill your brain with amazing ideas, inspiration, etc., where creativity and science, because to be real, experimentation is scientific to a sense. It's even back in the days, Marie Curie, she was the one who created a lot of this just ideas and experimentation. So don't forget Opticon. That is Optimizely's conference in Vegas. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to any of us at Optimizely or James directly, because his email's on there.
Can I just say too, on the Opticon front, for anyone who's on the webinar today, whether you're from Australia or elsewhere in the world and you haven't been to Opticon, I highly, highly recommend it. I got the chance to attend OptiCon 2016 personally, and I think it's, by far the best optimization conference going around. The chance of networking with other CRM professionals and CRO agencies and people doing this on the coalface every single day is, I was like a kid in a candy store, so I highly recommend it.
Yeah, I mean, who doesn't get to talk about this over a course of a couple of days and not just come back absolutely inspired? So James, from bank hacker to CRO geek, you gave us some amazing information, the awesome formula, the 10 core principles, and you only gave us a taste of those, so we know where to reach out to you if we want to get more information on those. I really hope everyone enjoyed this. Some straightforward idea generation tactics, some strategy behind the test. Really excited. Thank you so much, James, for your time and for being with us here on this webinar series. Just a reminder, our next webinar series will be on the 16th of August. That will be in the experimentation methodology section of planning, and it's using statistical modeling to supercharge your experimentation plan. So
thank you very much, Holly, and I hope everyone's had a fantastic day, and I look forward to speaking to you all soon.
Great. Go out and experiment everywhere.
Get experimenting.
Thanks.